Welcome, welcome everybody. I'm so happy to be here at Petersburg, Virginia, and thank you so much for sending us here to Petersburg, Virginia. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to show you a lot of videos as part of our North Carolina swing, and man, we'll have special guests and access to places you usually don't get to go. So with no further ado, let me bring on one of my favorite Civil War people. He's a co-founder of the American Battlefield Trust's predecessor organization, author, ranger extraordinaire, used to run Pamplin Park. Come on, A. Wilson Greene or Will Greene.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and welcome to Petersburg National Battlefield. We're standing at Battery 5 on the Confederate Damok line. Now, the earthworks that you see here facing off to the east is a part of it's part of Battery 5, which was one of 55 artillery positions that encircled Petersburg, beginning in the late summer of 1862 and continuing through the early part of 1863. The motivation for building these defenses was actually the Peninsula Campaign of the spring and summer of 1862. Petersburg, the seventh largest city in the Confederacy, the junction point for 5 railroads, 23 miles south of Richmond, obviously a very important place on the map, was virtually defenseless during McClellan's 1862 Peninsula Campaign. Confederate strategists woke up and decided, boy, if McClellan had gotten his way and come across the James River like he wanted to do and targeted Petersburg, the cockade city of Petersburg would have been defenseless. So a construction campaign began, led by a young engineer named Captain Charles Damok. Damok was the man supervising the construction of this 10-mile-long line, 55 batteries connected by infantry curtains all around the city. We're east of Petersburg right now. Battery 1 was on the Appomattox River just to our north, and then the batteries swing around in numerical order down to the south, and then they swing around facing to the south, and then they swing around facing to the southwest, and Battery 55 is at the Appomattox River west, or upriver from Petersburg. So Damok was the man responsible for constructing these artillery positions. Now, these were all redans, and a redan is a artillery position that has an open rear. Now, as you look behind me here, you see that there are earthworks behind Battery 5, and we'll talk a little bit about why they're there in a few minutes, but they're not part of original Battery 5. All the redans had, by definition, an open rear so that artillery could be easily pulled out and moved to a different direction. Now, Petersburg was not heavily defended by troops. The problem with the Damok line was that it would take tens of thousands of infantry and artillery to fully man this defensive position. And those troops were never available to Petersburg. So as this campaign for Petersburg begins, in the second week of June of 1864, the Confederate commander here, P.G.T. Beauregard, the commander of the Department of Southern Virginia, North Carolina, had only about 6,600 troops to defend all of Petersburg and all of the defensive line through Bermuda Hundred. In other words, from the James River all the way through Bermuda Hundred, almost to Richmond, down and around Petersburg, he only had about 6,600 men. And who was bearing down on him? The 37,000 men of the Army of the James, which Beauregard had managed to stymie during May in the Bermuda Hundred campaign, and the 80-some thousand men of the Army of the Potomac, who had been fighting those vicious battles of the Overland Campaign at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Courthouse, at the North Anna River, at Totopotomoy Creek, and most recently at Cold Harbor. Grant had very badly bloodied the Army of Northern Virginia. He had destroyed the Army of Northern Virginia as an offensive weapon, but he had not vanquished it as a strong defensive weapon. He had run out of room. General Grant, overall commander, general-in-chief of all Union armies, commanding both Butler's Army of the James and George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac. Grant made the bold decision 2 days after the fighting at Cold Harbor to move the Army of the Potomac across the mighty James River and to target Petersburg. And that would be an elaborate operation that Grant pulled off brilliantly.
There's so much you just said there, Will. Thank you so much. So first of all, man, I feel like giving a whole discussion about earthworks. What's a redan, a lunette, what's a redoubt and everything like that. We'll get into that. We're at Petersburg, so we'll have plenty of opportunities for that. Two, I just find, it necessary, just so everybody knows, again, Will said we're talking about 1864 here, and in 1864, we all know about the two big thrusts. Grant and his army group are moving toward, Richmond and Petersburg, and you've got Sherman moving toward Atlanta, right? But there are three other operations. Will mentioned one of them already. You've got the Army of the James trying to incur between Richmond and Petersburg. You've got Nathaniel Banks in the Red River campaign, and you've got Franz Sigel moving kind of up the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. The three of them don't really come to much, so we really do just focus on the efforts for Atlanta and Richmond. But what I wanted to ask you, Will, is that, people talk about like, oh, it's amazing, Grant crossed the James River. Why is that so amazing? I mean, armies cross rivers all the time, but the James isn't your normal river, right?
No, the James River, where Grant crosses it, is more than 2,000 feet wide and 80 feet deep, with a 4-foot-high tide. The operation, not only does he have to get across this mighty river, but he has to do it in a way that makes Lee freeze in his position north of the James and not attack either Butler when Grant is not within striking distance of reinforcing Butler, or attacking Grant himself while Grant is astride the river. I mean, when is an army, Gary, more vulnerable than it is when crossing a river? So he has to do this secretly, he has to do it quickly, and logistically he has to figure out how to get these men across this river. And in order to do this, he has an elaborate operation. He assembles this motley fleet of transport boats, and the first Union troops to come across the river are going to be transported by boat. And then he tasks Butler and Butler's engineer, Godfrey Weitzel, with the responsibility of building a pontoon bridge across the James River. And remarkably, they are able to do this in less than 24 hours, the longest bridge in military history since the days of Xerxes, writes Edward Porter Alexander. And Grant's operation getting to the James River is almost flawless. He feints towards Richmond to help pin Lee into thinking that maybe Grant is going to be moving towards the Confederate capital in just the way that McClellan did 2 years earlier. What's Lee's primary responsibility? It's to defend Richmond. Beauregard is down here in Petersburg, not really knowing anything more than Lee does, but constantly asking Lee to get reinforcements down here. Particularly, he wants his missing division under Robert Hoke to be sent from Lee's army back down to Petersburg. Lee will incrementally send troops towards Petersburg, but in my opinion, the story is always, well, Grant stole a march on Lee. Lee was really derelict in not moving to Petersburg quicker. I agree with the proposition that Grant stole a march on Lee. Brilliant operation by Grant. But I'm not sure that I blame Lee. Lee has no idea where Grant is, because Grant has, one of the things he's done is he's sent 2/3 of his cavalry up towards the Virginia Central Railroad. What does that do? Well, that draws most of Lee's cavalry to fight General Sheridan. Of course, the battle is in June 11th at the Trevilian Station, but that is part of Grant's thinking here. Let's get rid of the Confederate cavalry. Let's feint towards Richmond to keep pin Lee in place, and then let's move on 4 different roads to get down to a crossing point while the engineers have picked out the best place to build this pontoon bridge. What happens once Grant gets to the banks of the James, however, is a different story. You might use the analogy of a football game in which a team mounts a spectacular drive from their own 10-yard line, and they get right down to the opponent's 5-yard line. First and goal. They've been moving brilliantly. And then they just completely collapse. And that, in my opinion, is what happens once Grant gets to the James.
That's actually what happens in most games of chess that I've been playing lately on chess.com. Man, I'm winning, there's no way I'm going to lose, and then I'm just completely stymied right at the end. Separate story, I suppose. Let's walk a little bit here, Will, because we're setting things up really well. Is there anything else you want to say here about Battery 5 before we leave?
Well, it's one of the larger batteries. These batteries were not all built in cookie cutter style. They were all designed by Captain DeMock in order to take advantage of the terrain. And they also were in mutual supporting artillery distance from one another. I don't know if you can see, but off to the south and to the east, in that corner of woods beyond the parking lot, is the remains of Battery 6. And then beyond that is Battery 7. Both of those batteries exist in rather poor condition, but they're still there. Battery 4 would be off to my front, off to the north and west a little bit. The point is that Captain DeMock put these batteries in mutual supporting distance so that there would be not only frontal fire against an attacker, but also flanking fire from both sides, so that any attacking force would get frontal fire and enfilade fire from both flanks. The problem was, by June of 1864, the works had not been as well maintained. Now, as we look around back here to the east, we can see that there's a pine forest right in front of us. I think it's obvious that that would not have been here in 1864. One of the things that the Confederates did was to clear a field of fire at least 500 yards broad in front of their works. They also placed abattis, which are Civil War version of barbed wire, obstructions to slow down any attacker. Some of that abattis had deteriorated in the intervening months, and it wasn't as strong as it should have been. Captain DeMock, not really criticizing him, but there were inherent weak points in the DeMock defense line. And one of them was off to our south. Now, we can't really see where it is, but maybe later we'll be able to show it to you. If you've ever been to Petersburg, you've arrived at Petersburg Battlefield via Virginia Highway number 36. Which runs through a ravine. Well, no Highway 36 in 1864, but there was a ravine. And that was a weak point. That was a place where potentially enemy troops could get into defilade. In other words, be in a position where they could not be shot by the majority of the Confederate defenders here. Now, who were the Confederate defenders? I mentioned that these men are all under the command of General Beauregard, who is in command of a separate department. General Lee has no authority on the morning of June 15th over the troops that are here at Petersburg. They're all reporting to General Beauregard. Beauregard has 2 divisions in his army, 2 divisions of infantry, Bushrod Johnson's division and Robert Hoke's division. But as I mentioned a moment ago, General Hoke's division was brought north of the James River to help defend the Confederate position at Cold Harbor. Hoke had not yet returned to Beauregard's command. Beauregard had responsibility, as we said before, for not only these defenses at Petersburg, 10 miles of defensive line, but also the 4 miles between the Appomattox River and the James River, known as the Howlett Line, And that was the Confederate defensive position that held General Butler's Army of the James from reaching the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike and the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad. So General Beauregard has a very, very big responsibility geographically with a small number of troops. What did he have down here at Petersburg? Well, he really had only about 4,000 troops altogether, and that included about 1,000 militia troops from Petersburg. Sunshine soldiers, old men, young boys, guys that were not eligible for regular military service. Here at Battery 5, he had the 26th Virginia, one company of some South Carolinians, and 5 pieces of artillery. The line would extend down. He had the 34th Virginia, the 64th Georgia, the rest of the 23rd South Carolina, and then about 1,000 militia. Beauregard's defenses only extended from Battery 1 on the Appomattox River down to about Battery 23 at the south gateway to Petersburg on a highway known as the Jerusalem Plank Road. West of Battery 23 were the 1,300 cavalry of James Deering's brigade that was associated with Beauregard's army here, spread out on the rest of the line, basically indefensible. So Beauregard was very thinly represented here. His greatest strength at Petersburg on the eve of the beginning battle was his artillery. He had at least 22 pieces of artillery facing off here to the east. That would be much more of a problem for any attacker than the thin line of infantry that he had.
Yeah, and let's think about this. I mean, I think what we're talking about here is Will's listing off the regiments here. I mean, you're talking about a Confederate regiment, theoretically, in numbers, in concept, facing off against a Union brigade or division on average. I mean, if you total up the number of the Union brigades that are going to be here shortly and compare that to the number of Confederate regiments, you might be starting to talk about the right neighborhood.
So, question here, what kind of experience do these Confederate troops have, the ones that are manning this line?
Well, Beauregard's troops here, Johnson's division and then eventually Hoke's division, they have some combat experience. They're not complete rookies. Sometimes they have fought with the Army of Northern Virginia, other times they have been down here in Beauregard's department. So their experience is not really the problem, it's their thin numbers. And not to get too far ahead of our story, but on the afternoon of June 15th, when the fighting is about to begin here, I said that Beauregard had maybe 4,000 troops, including 1,000 of these militiamen, and 1,300 cavalry that were way out to the west that were almost irrelevant to the defensive position here. How many federal troops were going to be advancing against them? Immediately 14,000. So as Garry says, you have tremendous odds here. 5 to 1 basically of odds here for the Federals. Only thing standing between the Federal Army and their target at Petersburg is this thin line of Confederate defenders behind this strong but vulnerable set of Confederate earthworks.
And we don't want to, like Will said, we got lots more to come, a lot more to do. I mean, we're a lot closer to Petersburg than Grant was to Richmond at the time. That's going to figure into things. Let me just say, the voice from behind the camera you heard, that's Doug Allman. And about 9 years ago or so, the three of us, Will, Doug, and I, came out here, shot all the video, and worked on the Petersburg Battle app. If this stuff is confusing to you, download the free Petersburg Battle app at the App Store or at Google Play. Go to battlefields.org. We have 2 Petersburg hubs. There's a Petersburg hub and a Petersburg Breakthrough hub where you can find all sorts of articles, videos, and things like that. And look at our Petersburg itineraries where we tell you the best way that we think that you should see Petersburg in just a day or two. Now, thanks for joining the American Battlefield Trust on this series in Virginia and North Carolina. We appreciate you coming along with us for the ride. Just before we stop this video, Will, we're standing here. You talked about the battle sort of maybe opening here. Is it appropriate then to talk about that building behind you and whose farm we're on?
Sure. This is the building that you see off here to my left is the Civil War Centennial Era Visitor Center that the National Park Service maintains at Petersburg National Battlefield. Back in the 1960s, when they were putting in these visitor centers in a initiative that was called Mission 66 for the National Park Service, an attempt during the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service's founding to improve visitor access and visitor facilities. The concept was you put visitor centers right in the middle of the most important places that visitors would want to see. Now that seemed like it made sense. Let's get the visitors to where they want to go. Of course, I think that's contrary to what most of us think today, that we want to move visitor facilities away from the core of the battlefield, so they're on the periphery and they're not interfering with the historic scene. But we have this visitor center now from 1964. It's sitting on a farm that was known as the Jordan Farm. Petersburg, this whole area was pockmarked with small farms, a couple of larger semi-plantations in this general area, but we're only a couple of miles from wartime Petersburg here. So these were smaller farms, middle-class type people. The Jordan house sat right over in this grove of trees that you see. The foundations still exist. The Jordan family cemetery is off behind me with a few graves right by what became Battery number 6. And it's difficult for us to see here that we're sitting on top of a plateau. But in a moment, when we go down to shoot our next scene, you'll see exactly how high up we are here on the Jordan farm. And adding to the challenge that the federal attackers would have in capturing this position.
And I'll just close by saying that the Jordan Cemetery, the Battery 6, which is, I think, one of them is in between sort of the clover leaf of coming into the park, some of the World War I trenches we might talk about. These are some of the things you'll find on the Petersburg Battle app that we worked on. We're talking about 9 offensives and scores of battles and engagements, but we put as much into that app as possible. So thank you, Will, for setting up this first scene with us. Thanks to Doug behind the camera, and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.